Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the reading assignment on Fodor, which is pages 166 through 170 of the PDF. And page 166 is largely just some vocabulary preliminary, so I'm going to scroll down past that and get to the real topic of that reading assignment, which is Jerry Fodor's theory of functionalism. And before I get to an analysis of the text itself, I want to remind you about what we've been talking about in this unit up to this point. We started off with a discussion of Descartes and his version of dualism to give us an account of mind. And then from there we looked at Gilbert Ryle and Gilbert Ryle's criticism of Descartes and his suggested alternative of behaviorism. And then we looked at Frank Jackson and his version of dualism, very specific version of dualism titled epiphenomenalism. And what I said in one of the previous videos was that part of the reason why we're discussing so many different philosophies of mind is because each of them have a different set of problems. And so the way we've been sort of progressing through them is we sort of see how a philosopher comes up with a theory in an attempt to answer an issue, and it might address one issue better than a previous theory, but it brings up these other problems. And that's sort of what Jerry Fodor is doing. Jerry Fodor is going to be stepping into the mix here, and what he's going to be doing is sort of pointing out that, well, dualism has its problems and behaviorism has its problems. So let's come up with something new here that can still address the topic of mind and what we mean to describe by a mental event or a mental phenomenon from a different theoretical perspective. So enter in Jerry Fodor from his very famous article from a popular science magazine. So this wasn't a it was published in 1981 in Scientific American. So this wasn't some exclusive academic journal that he published this in. It was published in a magazine that you could have purchased at a grocery store in 1981. And it was just titled, The Mind-Body Problem. And I want to go ahead and read this first green highlighted paragraph from that, from this indented green portion here. And of course, anything that is indented with a header like this is what we call a primary resource. This is what Jerry Fodor is saying himself. And Fodor says the chief drawback of dualism is its failure to account adequately for mental causation. If the mind is non-physical, it has no position in physical space. How, then, can a mental cause give rise to a behavioral effect that has a position in space? To put it another way, how can the non-physical give rise to the physical without violating the laws of conservation of mass, energy, and momentum? And remember this visual aid that I'd used in the previous lecture video. Whenever he's talking about the failure to account adequately for mental causation, he's talking about these arrows right here that are moving between these two different realms of being, these two different ontological planes, as it were. Remember, for somebody like Descartes, he thinks that we have two different types of substance. We have this mental stuff and we have this physical stuff. And he makes this further claim that the mental stuff interacts with the physical stuff and the physical stuff interacts with the mental stuff. So whenever Fodor says here, whenever he's talking about, well, how is this possible? How can the non-physical being this mental stuff, right? How can the non-physical give rise to the physical? How can a purely mental event, which isn't physical and doesn't exist in space, but the body is physical and does exist in space, so how can this mental stuff give rise to a physical event? We saw how Frank Jackson attempted to answer that problem within a dualist framework, but it's still unsatisfactory because you still have a physical event here giving rise to a mental event. And if this mental event isn't causally connected to another event, then it's not entirely clear how the physical can give rise to the mental, right? We understand sort of how one physical thing can interact with another physical thing. These types of relationships here are not at issue. What's at issue is these types of relationships there. And whether you're talking about Cartesian dualism or epiphenomenalism, the same problem is presented. So that's what Fodor is pointing out here in these opening paragraphs. So now he gets into what he's going to be suggesting. And what I mean by suggesting is like, well, if we're going to be rejecting behaviorism, if we're going to be rejecting dualism, well, what is the correct account of mind if those aren't the correct ones? So reading this blue highlighted paragraph, in the past 15 years. Now, of course, whenever, Jerry Fodor says in the past 15 years, he's writing those words in 1981. So he's going back to the mid-1950s here. In the past 15 years, a philosophy of mind called functionalism, that is neither dualist nor materialist, has emerged from philosophical reflection on developments in artificial intelligence, computer theory, linguistics, cybernetics, and psychology. So think of all the debate that's centering around artificial intelligence right now. Philosophers have been discussing these issues for the last 70 years. So this is not a new topic in philosophy. It's just a new topic as far as the popular zeitgeist is concerned. It's become culturally relevant. But again, as in the field of philosophy, these issues are 70 years old. But what I want to talk about here is this particular line. Whenever Fodor says, in the past 15 years, a philosophy of mind called functionalism, that is neither dualist nor materialist. Well, that's an interesting phrase there, not materialist. Fodor is very specific. This is not a materialist account. He's talking about functionalism, and he's saying that it is not a materialist account of mind. But look how John Chafee, the author of your textbook, phrases it. He puts functionalism in section 310, which is titled, "The Self is the Brain." Physicalism. Physicalism is just another name for materialism. And yet you have Jerry Fodor himself say in no uncertain terms that functionalism, right there, is not materialist, is not a physicalist account. So we have to understand exactly what he means by that. He says down here, he says, in the functionalist view, reading from this green highlighted passage, the psychology of a system depends not on the stuff it is made of, living cells, metal, or spiritual energy, but on how the stuff is put together. So a dualist, someone like Descartes, remember, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The thinking part for Descartes is purely mental, right? It's not the brain that does the thinking, because I can imagine myself without a body. And if I don't have a body, then I can't possibly have a brain. But there's still a thing that is doing the thinking. There's still a thing that is doing the doubting, right? And that doubting, thinking thing is purely mental. So it's the mind that does all the thinking. And so what Descartes would say about robots, androids, even animals, is that they don't think at all. They behave in a certain way. They respond to their environment in a certain way, but they don't think. They don't have thoughts. They don't have desires. They don't have wants. They certainly don't have doubts, what Descartes would say, because the types of entities I just mentioned are monistic. They just have one type of stuff. So what Descartes would say about a robot, about an android, is that it definitely has a body. It just doesn't have a mind, meaning that it doesn't have cognition, right? Because cognition is associated with the cogito, which is a kind of mental stuff. What Fodor is saying is in opposition to that. So he's going to be denying dualism. He's going to say, no, dualists are wrong. He said, in the functionalist view, the psychology of a system depends not on the kind of stuff it's made of. And notice the examples: living cells, metal, or spiritual energy. So according to somebody like Fodor, I don't know why that just made a little highlight there. I still had it on the highlight pen, and I can't remember where the. Sorry, here I'm distracted. I'm trying to get this to go away. I thought there was an undo button. Now I can't find the undo button. Oh well, I guess I'll just leave it there for the moment. What was I talking about? I'm sorry, I got distracted. So I was talking about these examples here: living cells, metal, or spiritual energy. So whenever Fodor's talking about living cells, he's talking about entities like me and you. He's talking about these biological, entities. That would be a living cell. But then he says metal. So by metal, think of something like C3PO or the Iron Giant or something like that. What Descartes is going to say, what he's committed to saying, is that, well, the robots, androids, they might exist in the world and they might even behave a certain way, but they don't have thoughts and they don't have feelings. They don't have mental states more generally. What Fodor is going to say is like, well, of course they're capable of having it, right? Because what Fodor is going to say is that what constitutes mind, what constitutes mentality, is not the kind of stuff, but what the stuff does. So whether we're talking about spiritual energy, and there think of something like Casper the Ghost, or we're talking about something metal, think of, Iron Giant, C3PO, R2D2, those types of entities from science fiction, or living cells, human beings, but also cats and dogs, animals more generally. What Fodor is going to say is, well, there's lots of types of entities that can have mind. And so what Fodor goes on to do is develop this idea. What Fodor is going to say is that mind is basically whatever mind does, which is to say, if something functions in an environment the way an entity with a mind would function, then you have to say that the entity in question has mind, which is to say has mental processes, has mental events. And scrolling down here, in his explanatory notes, John Chafee makes mention of this input-output model, and that is a metaphor that Fodor uses whenever describing mind and mentality as not just behavior the way somebody like Gilbert Ryle does. What Fodor does is describe mind in terms of this causal relationship between sensory input and behavioral output. And what Fodor is going to say is that, well, again, any entity that behaves like it has mind has mind. What mind is, whatever mind does. And so if you think of the question like, well, how do you know that I possess mind? Now notice the way I phrased that. How do you know? So we're framing this as an epistemological issue, not a metaphysical issue. For somebody like Descartes, the issue of mind is entirely an issue of metaphysics. It's a question of the kind of stuff that we're dealing with, right? What Fodor is going to be doing is, again, reallocating the question of mind from the metaphysical realm to the epistemological realm. So how do you know that I have a mind? Well, on the basis of what you observe, right? You observe me functioning in an environment the way an entity with a mind would function. So with that in hand, go back to this notion of input and output, sensory input, behavioral output. How would you know that somebody is scared, right? How would you know that somebody is frightened? Well, in terms of behavioral input, sensory input and behavioral output. If you pull a blaster out and start firing at me, you're going to hear me scream, you're going to see me throw up my hands, you're going to see me run in the other direction. You're going to say, wow, Dan is scared. Well, what would happen if you pulled out a blaster and started firing at C3PO? Well, C3PO is going to throw up his hands, he's going to scream, and he's going to run in the other direction. So notice that C3PO is behaving in the environment in terms of sensory input, behavioral output, the exact same way that an entity with a mind is behaving in responding to the environment. And so if you're going to say that you know that I'm scared, and why are you saying that I'm scared? Because of what you just observed. And what did you just observe? Well, you observed me experiencing sensory input, and you also observed me demonstrating behavioral output. Well, that's exactly what you observe with C3PO, right? So whereas Descartes' going to say that C3PO isn't scared, he's not having that mental event because he doesn't have a mind. Creatures without minds can't possibly experience mental events. What Descartes is going to say is that, C3PO is just sort of blindly and dumbly responding to this, behavioral logarithm that was programmed into him. What Fodor is going to say is, well, we have no reason to rule out the possibility of C3PO having a mind. For the same reason you say that I have a mind, on the basis of what you're observing. You observe me experiencing sensory input, you observe me displaying a behavioral output. In short, I'm functioning the way that an entity with mind would function. And thus you have to say, on pain of inconsistency, that anything that is fulfilling that function is in fact an entity with mind. And one more example here about this input-output model. Think of a vending machine and the variety of vending machines. And I'll get more specific. Think of a vending machine for drinks. And think of the different types that you can see. You can see, sometimes you'll see a vending machine that has this robotic arm that operates on an X and Y axis. You put in money, you press a button, and then you have this robotic arm go up on that XY axis, grab a drink, and then deliver it to you. That's a vending machine. But we have other types of vending machines. We have other types of vending machines where you put in money, you press a button, and it keeps all the drinks stacked up, and it has a little trap door. And once you press that button, the little trap door opens, will eject a soda out, and you received the vending machine. You received the soda. Now notice, it doesn't matter how the vending machine is put together, right? A vending machine is what a vending machine does. Input, I put in money. Output, I get soda. So anything that fulfills that function is a vending machine. So now we can begin to expand the concept of what a vending machine is. A vending machine is anything that functions, fulfills the function of a vending machine. So you can think of, two ladies from a church at a church charity picnic or something like that, with a little styrofoam cooler filled with the generic root beer in it. And you can come up and you can put a dollar bill on the table, and a nice lady's going to reach into a styrofoam cooler and give you a can of generic root beer. Well, that's input and output, right? You input money as an output of soda. So that is the functional equivalent of a vending machine. So again, we're just understanding what something is, not in terms of its stuff, but what it does. Think of something like currency. How would we understand currency? Currency is a functional concept. Notice that currency is just a way that you can pay for something, a good or a service. And notice that you can go to a store and you can purchase something. And how can you purchase something? Well, you can take greenbacks and you can put it up there. You can use metal coin. You can write a check. You can use Apple Pay. You can use Bitcoin. You can pay for it through Venmo or a direct bank transaction. Now notice that there's a difference in substance with all of those. Greenbacks, well, that's just paper money. And then you have coin, that's metal. It's a different kind of stuff. But it doesn't matter what the stuff is. What matters is whether you can complete the transaction. And you can complete the transaction whether you're using paper money, metal coin, or even something non-material altogether, such as an electronic bank transaction. It doesn't matter what the stuff is made of, right? It doesn't matter what the nature of the currency is. What matters is what it does. And notice that you can't make a purchase with monopoly money, even though it's made from paper, which is the same thing a dollar bill is made from, right? The stuff is the same, but monopoly money does not function the way currency functions. The kind of stuff just doesn't matter. The substance doesn't matter. What matters is what it does, how it functions, and that's what the Fodor is going to be emphasizing. So getting back to that question is like, well, if Fodor says that functionalism is not materialistic, is not a physicalist account of mind, then how are we to understand why John Chafee, the author of your textbook, is including it in this section here titled Physicalism? Because what Fodor is going to say, in the case of human beings, in the case of me, in the case of you, we have this physical thing, the brain, which is fulfilling the function of mind. So it's in that sense that functionalism is a physicalist account, because we're talking here about human cognition. And human cognition takes place through the brain, which is physical. But what Fodor is going to emphasize is that you don't have to have a human brain in order to have cognition. Think back to those examples I mentioned previously, C-3PO, Baymax from Big Hero 6. Those, according to Descartes, lack cognition. They lack a mind. They lack mental states. They lack thoughts. They lack feelings. What Jerry Fodor is going to say is, no, very clearly they possess all of those things because they're functioning in their environment the same as a human being would function. C-3PO doesn't have eyes, right? R2-D2 doesn't have eyes. Wall-E doesn't have eyes. They have cameras, but there's still visual information which is entering. They're functioning the way a human eye would function. Just because Wall-E doesn't have eyes doesn't mean that he can't see, right? And similarly, you have a brain. Wall-E has some complex circuitry. He has these silica chips, right? And he has these wires connecting various parts. Well, Wall-E is made from a very different kind of stuff than you or I are made from. But what Fodor is going to say is, again, the kind of stuff doesn't matter. What matters is, does Wall-E function in his environment the way an entity with a mind, me, you, would function? And what Fodor is going to say is, well, very clearly so, right? Of course, we're talking about a figure in fiction, but notice that what Descartes is going to say is that it's not even theoretically possible for a robot to have a mind. What Fodor is going to say, well, it's absolutely possible in theory for a purely mechanical metal, material system to possess a mind. That's something that Descartes explicitly denies. Fodor allows it because mind is whatever mind does. Something has a mind if it functions in the world. That something has. If it functions in the world the way an entity with a mind would function. Okay, I've been going on about 23 or so minutes for this video, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it to a close. I'd encourage you to look at the rest of this text on your own, but I think I've given you enough of an idea of what Fodor is going for and how Fodor contrasts his views not just with the behaviorist, but not just with the dualist, but also with the behaviorist. So with all those things being said, I'm going to bring this video to a close. I'm going to ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.